The individual recognized in historical records as John Adams entered the world on October 30th, 1735 in Braintree, Massachusetts, a town situated just south of Boston with a view of Boston Harbor. His father, John Adams Sr., was a farmer and a deacon who also engaged in shoemaking and served as a tax collector in the local area. He was the great-grandchild of Henry Adams, an immigrant who had journeyed to Massachusetts from Braintree in Essex, England in 1638. Henry Adams established the first colonial settlement at Braintree, Massachusetts, naming it in honor of his English hometown. John Adams Sr.'s financial standing in Braintree was sufficient to permit him to acquire his own farmstead in Quincy, located north of the town, although the family was not considered exceptionally affluent. John's mother, Susanna Boylston, hailed from a distinguished Massachusetts family in Brookline. She married John Adams Sr. in 1734, and their first offspring, John Jr., was born the subsequent year. They went on to have two more sons, Peter in 1738 and Elihu in 1741. John's early life mirrored that of the middle class in colonial Massachusetts during the mid-18th century. His education took place in a co-educational school where the curriculum primarily revolved around the New England Primer. This textbook, initially published by Benjamin Harris in the late 1680s, contained readings designed to instill in New England's children the puritanical religious convictions that had originally motivated their ancestors to settle in New England in the 17th century, seeking a place where they could practice their faith without restriction. Here he embarked on the initial phases of a traditional humanist education, studying Latin, rhetoric, logic, philosophy, and arithmetic. However, the curriculum was undergoing rapid evolution, reflecting the scientific advancements originating in Europe since the 16th century and the burgeoning Enlightenment. Adams demonstrated himself to be a bright student, yet even in his early adolescence, his rebellious nature and questioning of authority led to considerable difficulties while at Braintree Latin School. This contentious temperament would later prove invaluable for a revolutionary figure. Adams' birth and upbringing occurred during a period when America was vastly different from the nation he would inhabit in his later years. In the mid-18th century, the eastern seaboard of North America was dominated by British, French, and Spanish colonies. The Spanish held dominion over Florida, while the French had colonized New France, an area roughly corresponding to present-day eastern Canada. The British had initiated the establishment of colonies between these French and Spanish territories in the early 17th century, beginning in Virginia and New England, and subsequently expanding both northward and southward. By the time of Adams, there were 13 distinct colonies extending from New Hampshire in the north to Georgia in the south. These were generally categorized into three groups. In the northern region were the New England colonies, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and Adams's native Massachusetts, which with the city of Boston was the most economically thriving part of New England. Further south were the middle colonies comprising New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. These colonies were the most diverse in ethnicity and religion among the 13 colonies and were experiencing increasing economic significance due to the growth of New York and Philadelphia. The southern colonies, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, were less urbanized, with economies primarily based on the production of lucrative crops such as cotton and tobacco. This economic model led to the development of a substantial enslaved population in this region. All 13 colonies were under the governance of the British administration. The colonial inhabitants were subjects of the crown and, as such, paid taxes, despite lacking political representation in England. These issues would soon give rise to political unrest. Revolution was not in John Adams' mind in the 1750s. Instead, he was developing into a significant scholar. In 1751, he commenced his studies at Harvard University in nearby Cambridge, Massachusetts, the oldest institution of higher education in North America. Here, he became deeply engrossed in the works of prominent Greek and Roman authors, especially historians such as Thucydides, Livy, and Tacitus, and the rhetorical and political writings of Cicero and Quintilian. He was also influenced by the emerging political, philosophical, and cultural writings and perspectives of the European Enlightenment. These intellectual movements explored concepts of political liberty and representation as a response to the autocratic monarchies in countries like Russia and France during the pre-revolutionary Ancien regime. A particularly impactful work in this context was The Spirit of Law, authored by Charles Louis de Secondat, Baron de Montesquieu in 1748. It was rapidly translated into English in 1750, and with its arguments concerning political freedom and the legal rights of citizens, it became a foundational text influencing some of the founding fathers, including Adams, during the 1750s and 1760s. Indeed, Adams's fascination with law deepened considerably. After earning his Artium Baccalaureus, or ABET, from Harvard in 1754, he promptly began to pursue legal studies. He obtained an AM, equivalent to a master's degree, from Harvard in 1758 and was admitted to the bar to practice law in 1759 at the young age of 24. Around the time he completed his AM and was admitted to the bar, Adams started to court his third cousin, Abigail Smith. Their courtship progressed slowly for the era, and Adams did not propose for several years. Consequently, their marriage did not occur until October 1764. Their relationship was rooted in mutual respect, and Abigail served as a moderating influence on John. While consistently regarded as honorable by his political peers in later years, John was often criticized for his inflexibility in accommodating others' viewpoints and for exhibiting a degree of arrogance. He and Abigail established their home on his 912-acre farm in Quincy, just outside Braintree, which he inherited following his father's death in 1761. Adams began to cultivate a thriving legal practice, built upon his increasing recognition for intellectual and legal precision in the city of Boston. He and Abigail soon began their family with the birth of a daughter, named Abigail after her mother, in 1765. 5 more children would follow: John Quincy in 1767, Susanna in 1768, Charles in 1770, Thomas in 1772, and Elizabeth in 1777. Sadly, their 2 youngest daughters did not survive. Susanna passed away in infancy in 1769, and Elizabeth was stillborn. While Adams was engaged in his studies, developing his legal career, and courting Abigail, the 13 colonies were embroiled in conflict. In 1756, Britain and France entered into a war known as the 7 Years' War, considered by many to be the first global conflict in modern history due to its battles involving the primary adversaries and their allies across Europe, the Americas, and Asia. The war stemmed from general Anglo-French rivalry, but border disputes and conflicts between British territories in the 13 colonies and French holdings in New France, Canada, and Louisiana were also significant contributing factors. Numerous British subjects in the 13 colonies fought for Britain during the war. Adams did not participate in the war, as he was studying at Harvard when it commenced in 1756. However, he, like many other British subjects in the 13 colonies, was profoundly affected by the conflict. Following British victory in the acquisition of Canada from France in the Peace of Paris, which concluded the war in 1763, the colonial community of the 13 colonies had made substantial contributions to the war effort. Many believed that in the aftermath, they deserved greater political representation from the British government. Instead, they were disappointed to find that London's primary intention was to impose increased taxation on the colonies. This shift would begin to radicalize Adams and numerous others from the mid-1760s onward. Adams's political views were becoming more defined during this period, and he started writing and publishing frequently on various political matters. He did so somewhat discreetly, publishing articles under the pseudonym Humphrey Plowjogger in the Boston Evening Post. In these writings, he adopted the persona of a simple New Englander to critique the political perspectives of several prominent Bostonians who had been publishing in the Boston Gazette and other newspapers. While these Bostonians were often highly critical of British rule in the 13 colonies, Adams deemed it appropriate in certain instances, but elsewhere suggested that Crown officers in North America should be evaluated based on their actions, not solely on their designation as representatives of the Crown. These writings increasingly conveyed his desire to defend the rights of the colonial community against excessive British intervention in the 13 colonies, but Adams had not yet committed to overthrowing British rule in North America at this point. In 1765, the British government introduced the Stamp Act. This legislation mandated that all subjects in the 13 colonies must pay a tax on virtually all forms of paper or printed materials they purchased, whether it be a newspaper or a deck of playing cards. Adams became a prominent voice against it in Massachusetts, authoring several articles under his pseudonym Humphrey Plowjogger and another document titled Braintree Instructions. In these, he articulated his opposition on the grounds that Americans were not being taxed in the same manner as subjects of the Crown in England. The widespread outcry provoked by the Stamp Act led the British government to quickly retreat and repeal it in March 1766. Nonetheless, this episode is considered a pivotal moment in the growing discontent of the colonial community in the 13 colonies with British rule. It also marked the first time Adams publicly identified himself as an opponent of British policies in Massachusetts. By the late 1760s, Adams had relocated his young family to Boston and had risen to become the foremost lawyer in the city. He continued to express his objections to heavy-handed policies imposed by the Westminster Parliament in England. Notably, the Townshend Acts, introduced in 1767 and 1768, which again imposed new taxes on the 13 colonies. Yet he was also capable of acting in cooperation with the government. This was particularly evident following the Boston Massacre, an event that occurred on March 5, 1770 on King Street in the city. A group of British soldiers were surrounded by an irate crowd, leading them to fire upon the crowd and kill 5 individuals. Although the Boston Massacre was strongly condemned by leading New England political figures, including Adams, his cousin, Samuel Adams, John agreed to provide legal representation for the British soldiers involved in the incident. At the trials, Adams skillfully managed to select juries composed of sympathetic citizens and successfully secured acquittals for Captain Thomas Preston, the British officer in command, and his soldiers on all charges. Just a few months later, Adams was appointed to the Massachusetts legislature when a vacancy arose. All of this suggests that while he was critical of certain aspects of British rule in North America by the early 1770s, he was not yet committed to the idea of rebelling against the crown. If any event finally convinced Adams that the situation of the inhabitants of the 13 colonies could not be improved through peaceful negotiation with the Crown and the British government, this was an action by the British government intended to suppress the illicit smuggling of tea into the colonies by Dutch merchants and simultaneously to compel the colonial community in North America to purchase surplus tea stocks held in London warehouses by the British East India Company. Although the British government's desire to curb illegal tea smuggling was somewhat understandable, the manner in which the Tea Act was implemented was so poorly managed that it triggered violent unrest in the colonies. The most prominent example was undoubtedly the Boston Tea Party. In this event, incensed Bostonians boarded the Dartmouth, a British vessel in Boston Harbor, on December 16, 1773, and destroyed 342 crates of tea, much of which was thrown into the harbor. This action, which resulted in the destruction of tea valued at nearly $2 million in today's currency, was lauded by Adams as one of the grandest events in the history of resistance to British rule in the 13 colonies. It wasn't solely the Tea Act that ignited Adams's anger and propelled him towards radicalism against the British administration during the early to mid-1770s. Mounting indications of judicial and political overreach by Westminster within the colonies also played a significant role. For example, the British government initiated the direct payment of salaries to judges in Massachusetts and other regions from England. Adams and others interpreted this action as an effort to dismantle judicial autonomy and establish tyranny across the 13 colonies. This concern intensified when, as a punitive measure following the Boston Tea Party, the British enforced a naval blockade on Boston Harbor. The consequence of these actions was a decision by opponents of British governance in North America, later known as the Patriots, to organize a gathering of representatives from 12 of the 13 colonies, excluding Georgia, to strategize collaborative resistance against the government. This assembly, which became known as the First Continental Congress, convened in Philadelphia during September 1794. Adams was chosen as one of 4 delegates representing Massachusetts and journeyed to Pennsylvania. At the First Continental Congress, Adams quickly gained recognition as a figure capable of uniting disparate factions and brokering compromises on contentious issues. Among the 56 delegates, some, like John's cousin Samuel, were fervent patriots advocating for military action to establish a new nation independent from Britain. Conversely, others believed that avenues for negotiation with London still existed. At the opposite extreme were individuals who felt the First Continental Congress should solely aim to secure concessions from King George III in England, ruling out any permanent separation from the Crown in Britain. John adopted a centrist stance and became instrumental in guiding the delegates towards a compromise within a few weeks. This compromise materialized as the Continental Association, an agreement where each of the 12 colonies at the Congress pledged to boycott British trade. The objective was to exert pressure on London's policymakers to concede to patriot demands and address their grievances. Petitions detailing their complaints and specific requests were also directed to King George III in the English Parliament. With these measures in place, the First Continental Congress adjourned, and Adams made his way back to Massachusetts. Britain's reaction to the Continental Association and other developments in the colonies lacked any conciliatory tone, highlighting the burgeoning militias of non-regular soldiers formed by patriots in Massachusetts and elsewhere. The Parliament at Westminster dispatched a declaration to the king in February 1775. This statement asserted that the colonies were, in effect, in rebellion against the crown. Subsequently, in mid-April, Thomas Gage, the commander-in-chief of British forces in North America, issued an order for all militiamen to begin surrendering their weapons. When attempts were made to forcibly disarm units in New England on April 19, 1775, the initial armed confrontations of the American Revolutionary War erupted at Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts. The commencement of hostilities, coupled with the English government's refusal to offer any compromises in response to the First Continental Congress's petitions, solidified Adams's conviction that British rule in the 13 colonies needed complete dismantling. However, he would continue to portray himself for a time as a moderate figure seeking reconciliation with Britain. On April 22nd, he paid a visit to a patriot militia encampment, voicing his endorsement of their actions, yet expressing concern over their inadequate equipment. Just days later, he was selected to head the Massachusetts delegation to a subsequent assembly of representatives from the 13 colonies in Philadelphia, arriving at what is now known as the Second Continental Congress in mid-May. The summer of 1775, following the Second Continental Congress's commencement on May 10th, marked a profoundly significant phase in the American Revolution. A key early initiative, strongly championed by Adams due to his anxieties regarding the militia's condition, insufficient supplies, and lack of order, was the establishment of a professional army to wage war against Britain. Consequently, on June 14, 1777, the Continental Army was created by decree of the Second Continental Congress. Adams advocated for George Washington, a Virginia landowner with extensive military experience as a former British commander during the French and Indian Wars and the 7 Years' War, to be appointed as its inaugural commander-in-chief. The intention behind this was to bolster support for the revolt in the southern colonies by placing a Virginian at the helm of the Patriot Army. In this respect, Adams was crucial in George Washington's rise to prominence at this juncture. Conversely, he had a more limited role in drafting the Olive Branch Petition, a plea adopted by Congress on July 5th and directed to King George III. This petition declared the colonial community's loyalty and beseeched the king to directly intervene and initiate discussions between the government and the Congress. Adams, along with all other Congress members, signed the petition. However, he considered this final attempt at negotiation futile and now believed that war and independence represented the only viable course for the Patriots. The Olive Branch Petition faced outright rejection in Britain, and in August, the colonies were officially declared to be in rebellion. Thus, throughout the autumn and winter of 1775 and into 1776, Adams and his fellow members of the Second Continental Congress embarked on constructing a government from the ground up. This involved addressing the considerable challenges of raising funds and appointing officials to fulfill numerous essential roles. By the early summer of 1776, as the conflict intensified and the Crown and government in England showed no inclination towards a more accommodating approach, the moment had arrived to proclaim to the world the birth of a new nation in North America. To achieve this, a committee of 5 Congress members was formed to draft a document announcing their separation from British rule. Adams was among these 5, alongside Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, Robert Livingstone, and Thomas Jefferson, a Virginian. Jefferson served as the primary author of the Declaration of Independence, which brought the United States of America into existence. However, he did revise his original draft, incorporating suggestions and new ideas from his fellow committee members, notably Adams and Franklin. This marked the beginning of a significant relationship between Adams and Jefferson, one characterized by both friendship and rivalry that would span decades. One of their initial actions was presenting the Declaration of Independence to the Congress. It was duly ratified on July 4, 1756, following a passionate defense by Adams before his fellow Congress members. The United States had been officially established. Now it needed to solidify its independence through armed conflict. In its initial major phase, spanning from 1775 to 1778, the American Revolutionary War primarily unfolded in New England and the Middle Colonies. After a prolonged siege, the Patriots successfully wrested control of Boston from the British in the spring of 1776. Subsequently, Sir William Howe, the British commander-in-chief, adopted a revised strategy aimed at isolating New England from the Patriot capital in Philadelphia by securing New York and New Jersey. He achieved considerable success in this endeavor, capturing New York City in November 1776 before advancing on Philadelphia and seizing the Second Continental Congress's seat in the summer of 1777. However, revolutionary leaders had already evacuated the city. While Howe's campaign progressed, the British war efforts suffered a substantial setback in October 1777. Throughout these early war years, Adams held a prominent position within the Second Continental Congress and played a vital role in numerous of its undertakings. He served on 90 different committees and presided over more than 24, a workload exceeding that of any other Congress member. Two of his roles stand out particularly. In June 1776, he was appointed as the head of the Board of War and Ordnance. This entity functioned as the Continental Army's administrative branch. Before any soldier could discharge a rifle or musket at Saratoga or in New England, someone needed to manage the procurement of weapons and gunpowder for the Continental Army. This responsibility fell to John Adams, who dedicated months during the latter half of 1776 and into 1777, working 18-hour days to ensure the Patriot forces were adequately supplied. This function was intertwined with his second major contribution during this period: his efforts to cultivate robust diplomatic relations with key European powers such as France, the Dutch Republic, and Prussia, to acquire weaponry and essential equipment from them. Consequently, he was central to drafting the Model Treaty, a framework for commercial agreements between the United States and these European nations. In time, these diplomatic and economic connections evolved into direct military alliances with France and the Dutch Republic, actions of immense importance in shaping the trajectory of the American Revolutionary War. The Model Treaty, along with Adams's advocacy for stronger ties with European powers hostile to Britain, soon led to his departure from North America. Among European nations, France stood to gain most from British weakness and was the most probable candidate to ally with the nascent United States. Early in the war, France began providing economic aid and more resources. However, following the victory at Saratoga in October 1777, the Second Continental Congress believed they could persuade King Louis XVI's administration in Paris to agree to a more formal military alliance. This alliance would involve France dispatching a naval fleet and troops to North America to combat the British. To this end, Adams was appointed as a commissioner to France in November 1777, just weeks after Saratoga. He departed in the early spring of 1778, taking his eldest son, John Quincy, and leaving Abigail, who was becoming accustomed to her husband's prolonged absences, at their home in Braintree with their other children. The French mission proved to be a mixed experience. Upon Adams' arrival in Europe, he discovered that the French government had already consented to a military alliance. However, Adams then found himself frustrated in his efforts to achieve further progress. The French favored Benjamin Franklin's more relaxed and somewhat deferential demeanor, while Louis XV's ministers increasingly disregarded Adams. By the close of 1778, Philadelphia decided to appoint Franklin as minister plenipotentiary to France, effectively making him the official U.S. ambassador to the nation. Adams felt slighted by this development and opted to return home unilaterally, reaching Massachusetts in March 1779. Upon his return to North America, the Second Continental Congress concluded that the war had reached a stage where negotiations with the British might be feasible. Adams was chosen to explore this possibility. Consequently, he was dispatched back across the Atlantic to Paris once more, just over 6 months after his return to New England, with hopes of initiating contact with London. There, the previous challenges with the French resurfaced, and the war had reached a relative stalemate by early 1780, making the British hesitant to engage in serious peace talks. Disappointed, Adams left Paris in mid-1780 and journeyed to Amsterdam, hoping to convince the Dutch Republic to increase its support for the United States. Yet here, too, he encountered indifference, with the government in The Hague declining to acknowledge Adams' credentials as the U.S. ambassador to their country. As a result, Adams became increasingly doubtful about the European powers. He began to believe that each was primarily interested in utilizing the North American conflict for their own self-interest, and that none were truly dependable and unambiguous allies of the United States. Exhausted from years of relentless labor, he experienced a significant health episode in Amsterdam during August 1781, which may have been a form of minor nervous collapse. Adams's gloom in Europe during the late summer and early autumn of 1781 was alleviated by updates from North America regarding the war. Following the setback at Saratoga in October 1777, British strategy shifted to securing the southern colonies, intending to use them as a platform to continue the war against the Patriots further north. However, even this endeavor was undermined by the evolving international landscape. France's involvement in the war had provided naval assistance to the Patriots, and eventually Spain and the Dutch Republic also declared war on Britain. In 1780, 5,500 French soldiers disembarked on Rhode Island to aid Washington's Continental Army in an attempt to seize New York, the only major city in the Middle Colonies and New England still under British control. However, their plans soon changed, and they proceeded southward to lay siege to General Charles Cornwallis and his substantial force at Yorktown in Virginia. A 3-week siege ensued in the autumn of 1781, with a combined Franco-American army numbering roughly 16,000 personnel and nearly 30 warships encircling Cornwallis's 9,000 troops at Yorktown. Washington personally directed the siege, which quickly resulted in British capitulation. With the capture of over 7,500 British soldiers, it became unsustainable for the British to meaningfully continue the war. From late 1781, peace negotiations commenced in Paris. When news of the events at Yorktown reached Europe in late 1781, Adams observed his situation begin to transform as public sentiment in the Dutch Republic rapidly shifted in favor of the Patriots. In April 1782, he successfully persuaded the Dutch government in The Hague to recognize the United States as an independent nation and secured a substantial loan for the Congress. The cessation of hostilities and the treaty signing did not prompt Adams to return home. Instead, he was appointed to perhaps his most challenging ambassadorial role yet, becoming the first ambassador of the United States to Britain. He arrived in London in 1785, where his mandate was nothing less than attempting to establish amicable relations with the nation the U.S. had just been at war with. This nation was also the largest trading power globally and shared the longest border with the United States. He met King George III shortly after arriving in England, and they developed a cordial relationship based on a degree of mutual respect. However, Adams' time in London was otherwise complicated by the failure of both the British and U.S. governments to fully implement all provisions of the Treaty of Paris. In Philadelphia, for instance, the government was in no hurry to compensate British merchants and American loyalists. In turn, the British refused to relinquish control over several forts along the Ohio River, despite prior commitments. Adams' frustrations, however, were mitigated by the fact that his children were now old enough for Abigail to join him in London. This marked the first extended period they had spent together in several years. By 1788, it was evident that Adams could achieve little more in England than a less senior representative. Moreover, back in America, the political scene was evolving as leading statesmen were drafting the Constitution for the new country, and preparations were underway to conduct the first presidential election. Consequently, Adams and Abigail departed Britain and returned home. There, he observed a contest between proponents of a popular democracy with broad voting rights and conservatives who favored a limited form of democracy where landowners and the wealthy would wield significant power. The outcome was the U.S. Constitution, primarily drafted by James Madison, a Virginia political thinker who had served in the Second Continental Congress, along with figures like Alexander Hamilton. Madison was significantly influenced by the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780, a document to which Adams had made substantial contributions in the late 1770s. The U.S. Constitution, finally agreed upon in 1789, established a bicameral Congress, consisting of an upper chamber named the Senate, after the Senate of ancient Rome, and a lower chamber called the House of Representatives. Thus, the aspiration for popular democracy would be addressed by the House of Representatives, while the Senate would likely better represent the interests of the landed elite and affluent business class. Furthermore, the Constitution established a federal government, as each state, irrespective of its size, population, or wealth, would send 2 delegates to the Senate. This ensured that each state possessed equal power in legislative decisions. Beyond Congress, the judicial system would be overseen by a Supreme Court of Judges, while the executive branch would consist of a president elected for 4-year terms through the Electoral College, a mechanism where each state held a specific number of electoral votes. However, it soon became clear that George Washington was the overwhelming favorite across the 13 states in the presidential election, conducted over several weeks in late 1788 and 1789. Consequently, Adams and several other candidates entered the race for vice president, leaving Washington unopposed for the more senior position. In America's early years, the vice president was also elected through the Electoral College, rather than being a running mate chosen by the president, as is the practice today. Adams prevailed in the contest to become vice president. Therefore, in the spring of 1789, he journeyed to New York City, which had briefly become the temporary capital of the nation in the late 1780s. The capital was soon relocated back to Philadelphia, while a new permanent administrative capital was under construction along the Potomac River, a place eventually named Washington, D.C., in honor of the first president. While the office of vice president has gained power in modern times, throughout much of U.S. history, it has been a relatively insignificant role. The vice president held limited constitutional authority beyond presiding over the Senate. This was compounded by George Washington's decision to largely disregard him, with an exception concerning France. The French Revolution began in the summer of 1789, followed by the Revolutionary Wars. Washington sought Adams' perspective on these developments, given the vice president's prior experience in France. For his part, Adams was initially optimistic about the revolution, but soon came to view it as descending into barbarity once the period known as the Terror commenced in the early 1790s. Aside from Washington's consultations on French matters, Adams was largely marginalized within the administration as vice president. In time, he began to assert that the government had created for him, in his words, the most insignificant office that ever the invention of man contrived. Adams's years as vice president in the 1790s are more broadly significant in U.S. politics for the emergence of the first-party system. This system was dominated by two parties: the Federalist Party, established by Alexander Hamilton, which, as its name suggested, strongly favored fostering a robust federal union in the new nation and encouraging industrial growth in urban centers. It enjoyed stronger support in New England and more urbanized states like New York and Pennsylvania. Their rivals were the Democratic-Republican Party, founded by Jefferson and Madison. With a solid base of support in the southern plantation states, the Jeffersonian Republicans, as they were commonly known, promoted republicanism, agrarianism, and were more tolerant of slavery than the Federalists. This precursor to the Democratic Party also advocated for U.S. expansionism, believing the nation should strive to become the dominant power in North America. Adams soon aligned with the Federalist Party, supporting Hamilton's fiscal policies and the party's stance of seeking closer ties with Britain in opposition to the revolutionary government in France. He also championed a strong, centralized federal government. When Washington decided near the end of his second term against seeking re-election, believing the presidency would resemble a monarchy or military dictatorship if one person held the office for too long, it paved the way for the first contested presidential election in U.S. history. Jefferson was the leading candidate for the Democratic-Republican Party, although both parties nominated multiple candidates. Although Hamilton and Adams harbored mutual distrust, the various candidates did not campaign personally, as was customary at the time, but the war of words in newspapers was bitter, highlighting the divisions among the once united founding fathers. In the end, Adams emerged victorious, albeit narrowly, receiving 71 electoral college votes to Jefferson's 68, while the other Federalist candidate, Thomas Pinckney, came in a close third with 59 votes. The Democratic-Republican Party overwhelmingly carried the southern states for Jefferson, while the Federalists dominated New England. However, Adams secured sufficient support in the middle states of Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, and Delaware, the original swing states, to win the election. As Jefferson finished second, he became vice president, even though his relationship with Adams had deteriorated throughout the 1790s, with their friendship increasingly marked by animosity and rivalry. Adams was inaugurated on March 4, 1797. His presidency was largely defined by the question of whether to declare war on France. France was now at war with most major European powers, and its own revolution had descended into radicalism and extreme hostility towards organized religion. This alienated some in the U.S. and inclined them towards joining the anti-French alliance led by Britain. Adams's Federalist Party strongly favored war and adopted a pro-British stance. However, many in the U.S. still held strong anti-British sentiments and viewed the French as their allies from the War of Independence. Adams leaned towards peace and dispatched a diplomatic delegation to France, but it ended disastrously when 3 French ministers, anonymously designated as X, Y, and Z in official dispatches, demanded substantial bribes before fully committing to negotiations. When news of this development eventually reached the public, opinions toward the French deteriorated across the United States. Although this situation could have been leveraged by Adams to draw the U.S. into war with France, he resisted the urge to do so. The U.S. would largely maintain neutrality in the conflicts that persisted until 1815. Although the latter half of 1798 and early 1799 did experience naval skirmishes with France, compelling Adams to initiate the country's remilitarization. The Alien and Sedition Acts comprise 4 legislative pieces that specifically targeted French-born residents within the United States and agents of the French government. All 4 acts were enacted within a 2-week period during the summer of 1798. They were rapidly deployed against pro-democratic Republican Party newspapers. Consequently, they were criticized as tools designed to enable Adams to target his political adversaries, particularly Jefferson. However, this perspective disregarded numerous aspects surrounding the Alien and Sedition Acts, most notably that Adams did not propose them, but rather they originated among members of Congress, and Adams only reluctantly consented to sign them into law. Despite this, Adams has been frequently accused of press censorship and executive overreach ever since. Adams's presidency is also noteworthy for him being the first president to inhabit Washington, D.C. The capital of the United States in its initial years was primarily Philadelphia, with a brief interlude in New York in the late 1780s. However, early in Washington's presidency, a decision was made to establish an entirely new city to serve as the nation's capital. The selected location was the Potomac River, situated on the boundary between the states of Maryland and Virginia. The aim was to cultivate stronger ties with the southern states, which were least supportive of a robust federal government during the 1780s and 1790s. The new city, eventually named Washington, D.C., in honor of the war hero and first president, required several years for construction. Finally, in November 1800, progress was sufficient for Adams to relocate to the president's mansion, later renamed the White House. Congress convened for the first time in what was then called the Congress House, subsequently known as the Capitol Building. Yet harmony was not universal. Shortly before the move to D.C., civil unrest had disturbed Pennsylvania, spearheaded by a German-American named John Fries. Fries' rebellion, as it became known, ultimately remained bloodless, but it represented the 3rd tax revolt since independence. This indicated that while British authority had been removed, excessive taxation was still viewed with disapproval across much of the nation, a sentiment that has persisted in the United States ever since. For his part, Adams was inclined to demonstrate leniency towards the revolt's leaders and issued an executive pardon to Fries and several others who had been condemned to be hanged. The late 1790s also witnessed the further deterioration of the relationship between Adams and his vice president, Thomas Jefferson. What had once been a close friendship had significantly declined even before Adams assumed office in 1797. Matters did not improve during Adams' presidency. At the core of the issue was the simple fact that Adams and Jefferson held opposing viewpoints on most of the significant policy matters of the day. For example, Jefferson was unequivocally pro-French, and even after the XYZ affair, continued to advocate for an alliance with the revolutionary government in Paris. They also held differing perspectives on the nature of government, and they occupied diametrically opposed positions regarding the institution of slavery. Adams described it as an abhorrence and was instrumental in Massachusetts becoming one of the first states to progressively abolish slavery, beginning as early as the 1780s. In contrast, Jefferson was a staunch proponent and owned over 600 enslaved individuals during his lifetime. All of these factors exacerbated the divisions between the two men, and Adams seldom consulted with Jefferson as his vice president, much like Washington had not consulted Adams. The discord between Adams and Jefferson would culminate in 1800 as Adams's initial term approached its end. The presidential election of that year would see the two former friends and now rivals compete once more, as they had in 1796. However, for this occasion, the election rules had been modified. This election marked the first instance where the two primary parties nominated a single candidate, who then selected a running mate to serve as vice president should he win. Adams represented the Federalist candidate with Charles Pinckney as his running mate, while Jefferson stood as the Democratic-Republican Party candidate, accompanied by Aaron Burr, a lawyer and Continental Army veteran, as his running mate. It was a contentious campaign, with Jefferson's party criticizing Adams for his handling of relations with France and Britain, as well as excessive taxation. Already in his mid-60s, he intended to largely withdraw from public life and instead focus on agricultural work and writing. He commenced an autobiography, though he never completed it. Adams also faced financial difficulties in retirement. A significant portion of his funds was held and invested in Bird, Savage & Bird, a London-based trading firm specializing in exporting manufactured goods from England to North America and importing raw materials like cotton from the United States to supply the burgeoning textile factories in cities such as Manchester and Sheffield in industrial-age Britain. The company experienced a dramatic collapse in the final months of 1802 and early 1803, costing Adams approximately $13,000, equivalent to over $300,000 in today's currency. Fortunately, his eldest son, John Quincy, had by that time become a successful lawyer and diplomat, and was able to provide his parents with financial support by purchasing some of their property. While John Quincy achieved success, Adams was troubled by his other sons. Charles had developed a severe drinking problem while still a teenager in the mid-1780s. After years of alcoholism and extramarital affairs, he succumbed to pleurisy in 1800. A few years after John's retirement, his youngest son Thomas, who had trained as a lawyer, returned to Quincy. There, he too gradually descended into alcoholism, largely abandoning his legal practice and increasingly working as a caretaker around the farm, burdened by debt and mental health issues that caused his father considerable concern. Upon his retirement, Adams resolved to adhere to the precedent set by George Washington of remaining removed from politics and not interfering in the administrative and policy decisions of his successors. However, Adams was less successful in this endeavor than Washington. While he largely maintained silence during the initial years of Jefferson's presidency, significant events eventually drew him back into the public sphere. Such was the case in 1803 when Jefferson's administration proposed purchasing a vast tract of land from the French government, encompassing much of what is currently known as the Midwest. The Louisiana purchase was completed for $15 million and brought over 2 million square kilometers of territory, stretching from New Orleans in the south to Montana and North Dakota in the north, and westward to Wyoming and Colorado under United States ownership. Adams broadly supported this move, though he was critical of the Embargo Act of 1807, which imposed a trade embargo on all foreign nations in an attempt to prevent the British Royal Navy from forcibly enlisting American sailors into their fleet. This issue had arisen as the war between Britain and Napoleonic France intensified in Europe. Elsewhere, Adams endorsed the presidential campaigns of Jefferson's eventual successor, James Madison, and generally approved of Madison's handling of the War of 1812 when renewed conflict with Britain erupted. Adams' retirement also saw a complete rupture in his relationship with Jefferson. Upon leaving office in early 1801, he wrote to his successor, wishing him well in his presidency. Jefferson, rather discourteously, chose not to respond, possibly due to Adams's absence from Jefferson's inauguration, as Adams had departed the White House at 4 a.m. on the morning of Jefferson's swearing-in ceremony. This marked the final break in a relationship that had become severely strained during the 1790s. Consequently, Adams and Jefferson would not communicate or correspond for the subsequent 11 years. Despite an attempt by Adams' wife, Abigail, to initiate correspondence with Jefferson in 1804 following the death of his daughter Polly from childbirth, complications at the young age of 25. Ultimately, it was not until 1812 that a reconciliation between the two men who had authored the Declaration of Independence and then persuaded the Second Continental Congress to adopt it was achieved. Benjamin Rush, a fellow member of the Congress in 1776 and a signatory of the Declaration, acted as a mediator in their rapprochement. What ensued was an extensive exchange of letters over the next decade and more. Early on, Adams attempted to steer their discussions toward their political disagreements, stating, "You and I ought not to die before we have explained ourselves to each other." However, Jefferson demurred and suggested they let bygones be bygones. Adams eventually agreed. and their letters thereafter adopted the form of two men in the twilight of their lives, describing their retirement routines and reflecting on their philosophical views of life. Adams's final years were tinged with sadness, but also undoubtedly a degree of pride. Abigail passed away from typhoid fever in 1818 at the age of 73. Her last words to her 82-year-old husband were, "John, it will not be long." In fact, John would live for another 8 years. During that time, he witnessed his eldest son, John Quincy, who had spent years serving in various ambassadorial roles in Europe, positions Adams himself had held decades earlier, also serve as U.S. Secretary of State in President James Monroe's administration between 1817 and 1825. When Monroe's second term concluded, John Quincy ran for election as the Democratic-Republican Party candidate, defeating Andrew Jackson in one of the closest elections in U.S. history. Thus, the second president of the United States lived long enough to see his son inaugurated as the sixth president on March 4, 1825. For much of the 1760s and early 1770s, he believed that British rule could persist in the 13 colonies if the Crown made concessions and reformed its governing methods in North America. He even served as legal counsel for the British following the Boston Massacre in 1770. However, the Tea Act and other developments between 1772 and 1774 convinced him that British rule was devolving into tyranny and that establishing a new independent nation was the only viable path forward. When the American Revolution commenced, he was crucial to its progress, advocating for the creation of the Continental Army, acting as its administrative head by managing the Board of War and Ordnance, and playing a significant role in both drafting the Declaration of Independence and ensuring its ratification by the Second Continental Congress. His accomplishments did not end there. In the 1780s, he successively served as ambassador to the Dutch Republic, helped negotiate the Treaty of Paris, then served as ambassador to Britain, a challenging role in the post-war era, and subsequently returned to America to become the nation's first vice president. Finally, in 1797, he became the second president of the United States. Throughout his life, he displayed surprising enlightenment for his time, viewing slavery as disgraceful, and among the 5 founding fathers who eventually became president of the United States, he was the only one who was not a slave owner. Few of the founding fathers were as distinguished as he was. Yet a paradox has always existed regarding Adams as a political figure, one in which he frequently played second fiddle to others. Adams was central to the creation and management of the Continental Army, but he was overshadowed by George Washington, who led it on the battlefield. He was a significant contributor to the Declaration of Independence, but Thomas Jefferson receives nearly all the acclaim for writing it. In the 1780s, he was a key negotiator for the United States in Paris, but the Treaty of Paris is usually attributed to Benjamin Franklin. And when he finally attained the presidency, his time in office was marred by controversy and plagued by the issue of whether to wage war against France, a nation that had reviled Adams in Paris 2 decades prior and now returned to trouble his presidency. Consequently, among the first 5 presidents of the United States, the only 5 with a legitimate claim to involvement in the American Revolution, and who were therefore founding fathers of the nation, Adams was the only one limited to a single term, leaving office after 4 years while Washington, Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe each served for 8 years. This is likely the reason why Adams is less revered and recognized by the general public than some of his peers in the formation of the United States. However, as has been demonstrated, Adams was every bit as consequential a figure as George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Benjamin Franklin in the birth of the United States. What are your thoughts on John Adams? Was he perhaps the greatest of the founding fathers whose role in the American Revolution has been unfairly overshadowed by George Washington and Thomas Jefferson? Please share your opinions in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.